The hardest part about raising a child that isn't yours is learning how to hide your own fear. I was 17 when our parents died. In a matter of weeks, the comfortable middle-class life we knew evaporated, swallowed whole by bankruptcy lawyers and a faceless corporate buyout that left us with nothing but a mountain of debt and a modest life insurance policy. I didn't have time to grieve. I had a 7-year-old sister who still woke up crying for her mother, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, looking to me for answers I didn't have. So I grew up overnight. I traded college parties for night shifts and youthful dreams for accounting textbooks. Now at 32, I stood in the doorway of our small, cozy townhouse, watching Lily adjust the delicate pearl earrings in the hall mirror. She was 22, radiant, with a degree in fine arts and a heart that had somehow remained entirely unbruised by the world. That was my doing. I had spent 15 years building a financial consulting firm from a single folding table in a studio apartment into a stable, respected business, solely so Lily would never know the cold bite of desperation. "Do I look okay, Clara?" she asked, smoothing the skirt of her understated, elegant navy dress. Her eyes were bright, nervous. "You look beautiful," I said, stepping forward to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "He's a lucky man, and if his parents don't see that, it's their loss, not yours." Lily breathed out a shaky sigh. "Julian says they can be intense, traditional. I just want them to like me." "They will," I promised, though my chest tightened with a familiar, protective instinct. Julian Sterling was a good man. When Lily first brought him home to our modest living room 6 months ago, I had observed him with the ruthless, calculating eye of a woman who had spent a decade and a half surviving in a cutthroat business world. Julian was 25, born into the kind of generational wealth that usually breeds arrogance, but there was a quiet humility to him. He wore a Patek Philippe watch, but he also rolled up the sleeves of his expensive linen shirt to help me scrub pans after dinner. He looked at my sister as if she were the only source of light in the room. He had passed my silent tests. But I knew the real test wouldn't be Julian. It would be the architects of his universe. The drive to the Sterling estate in Connecticut took just under 2 hours, but crossing the threshold of their wrought iron gates felt like entering a different century. The driveway was lined with centuries-old oak trees, their branches forming a canopy over a path that seemed to stretch on forever before finally revealing the house. It wasn't just a house. It was a compound. A sprawling, stone-clad manor with manicured gardens that looked like they belonged on the cover of a European Architectural Digest. Julian squeezed Lily's hand in the passenger seat as I parked my practical 5-year-old sedan between a sleek Bentley and a pristine vintage Jaguar. I turned the key, the engine sputtering into silence, feeling the sudden, sharp weight of the disparity between our worlds. "Ready?" I asked softly. Lily nodded, taking a deep breath. We stepped out into the crisp evening air. The heavy oak doors were opened by a man in a tailored uniform before we could even reach for the brass knocker. We were ushered into a foyer that smelled of beeswax, old money, and fresh white lilies. The marble floors gleamed, reflecting the light of a massive crystal chandelier that hung like frozen rain from the vaulted ceiling. "Ah, the Vance sisters, I presume." The voice was smooth, cultured, and carried the undeniable cadence of a woman who was used to giving orders without ever having to raise her voice. Evelyn Sterling descended the sweeping staircase. She was a striking woman in her late 50s, wearing a simple silk blouse and trousers that probably cost more than my first car. Her hair was styled in an immaculate silver blonde bob, and her smile was practiced, flawless, and entirely devoid of warmth. Following close behind her was Richard Sterling. He possessed the silver fox gravitas of a seasoned Wall Street titan. His suit was bespoke, his posture imposing. He had the kind of eyes that didn't just look at you. They assessed your market value. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," Lily said, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "Thank you so much for having us." "Please call us Richard and Evelyn," Richard said, extending a hand to Lily, then to me. His handshake was firm, dominating. "Julian hasn't stopped talking about you. Both of you." "It's a pleasure to finally meet the family," Evelyn added, gliding forward. She didn't hug Lily. She offered a light, two-cheek air kiss that kept a polite, chilling distance. Then Evelyn's gaze shifted to me. Her eyes swept over my tailored but clearly off-the-rack charcoal suit. "And Clara, the older sister. Julian tells me you practically raised Lily all by yourself. How incredibly strenuous that must have been for you. It was a masterclass in high society condescension. The word strenuous wasn't a compliment. It was a velvet-wrapped reminder of our struggle, our lack of pedigree. It was an honor, Evelyn, I replied, my voice steady, my smile just as practiced as hers. Lily is my greatest achievement. How quaint, Evelyn murmured, already turning away. Shall we move to the dining room? The chef has prepared something light. Dinner was an exercise in psychological endurance. The dining table was a long expanse of polished mahogany, set with antique silver and crystal that caught the dim amber light of the room. A small army of silent staff moved like ghosts, pouring wine and serving courses of things I could barely pronounce. I sat across from Richard, with Lily and Julian flanking us. Throughout the meal, I watched Evelyn orchestrate the conversation. She didn't attack. She didn't insult. She used the kind of cold violence that only the ultra-rich have perfected, asking questions that seem polite but are designed to make you explain yourself, to make you feel small. Julian mentioned you graduated with a degree in fine arts, Lily, Evelyn said, delicately slicing a piece of seared scallop. How lovely! Art is such a wonderful hobby. Do you plan to find a practical application for it? Or will you be relying on Julian's resources once you're married? Julian tensed, setting his fork down. Mom, Lily is incredibly talented. She already has pieces displayed in 2 downtown galleries. Of course, darling, Evelyn smiled, though her eyes remained hard. I'm just thinking of the future. The Sterling name carries certain philanthropic expectations. We patronize the arts. We don't necessarily produce them for a living. Lily's cheeks flushed a deep, embarrassed pink. Before she could stammer an apology for her own passion, I placed my wineglass down. The gentle clink drew the table's attention. Lily's talent is her own capital, Evelyn, I said, my tone conversational, pleasant. In my experience as a financial consultant, the most valuable assets aren't always the ones sitting in a trust fund. They are the ones you build with your own 2 hands. Lily has a remarkable work ethic. She won't need to rely on anyone. Richard dabbed his mouth with a linen napkin, his eyes locking onto mine. Ah, yes. Julian mentioned you run a little bookkeeping firm, Clara. Self-made. Financial consulting and wealth management, I corrected smoothly, refusing to let him diminish 15 years of blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. Self-made is such an exhausting concept, don't you think? Evelyn sighed, taking a sip of her Pinot Noir. All that clawing and striving, it leaves so little room for refinement. But I suppose when one is left with nothing, one has to do what one must to survive. She was smiling. Richard was smiling. They were looking at us not as future family, but as charity cases they were being forced to tolerate. They were trying to establish dominance, to remind us that we were stepping into a kingdom where we had no royal blood. Survival teaches you a great deal about refinement, Evelyn, I replied, meeting her gaze dead on. I did not blink. I did not shrink. It teaches you to recognize exactly what is genuine and what is merely a performance. For a fraction of a second, the polite mask on Evelyn's face slipped. A cold, sharp realization passed between us. She knew in that instant that I was not a naive, easily intimidated girl. I was a woman who had fought wolves to keep my sister safe. A dinner table with expensive silverware wasn't going to break me. Julian quickly changed the subject, steering the conversation toward a charity gala Richard was organizing. The tension dialed back to a simmer, but the battle lines had been irreversibly drawn. They would tolerate Lily, but they would seek to control her. And to control Lily, they knew they would have to get through me. As dessert was cleared, Richard stood, buttoning his suit jacket. Julian, why don't you take Lily to see the rose gardens? They are quite spectacular in the evening lighting. Clara and I can enjoy a digestive. Actually, I said, rising gracefully from my chair, I would love to freshen up first, if you don't mind. Of course, Evelyn said, gesturing vaguely. Down the hall, second door on the left. I excused myself, walking down the long, hushed corridor. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood and wealth. I found the powder room, splashing a little cold water on my wrists, taking a moment to breathe. The anger was there, a hot ember in my chest, but I forced it down. I could endure their snobbery. I could endure anything, as long as Julian truly loved Lily. I dried my hands and stepped back out into the hallway. The house was vast, and the dim lighting created long, imposing shadows. As I walked back toward the dining room, I passed a set of heavy, double mahogany doors. One of them was left slightly ajar. I didn't mean to pry. But as I passed, the soft glow of a desk lamp caught my eye, illuminating the interior of Richard Sterling's private study. It was a massive room, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. But it wasn't the opulence that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was the framed insignia hanging prominently on the dark wood-paneled wall behind the massive executive desk. My breath caught in my throat. The air in my lungs suddenly turned to ice. It was a crest, a silver eagle gripping a globe, bordered by a wreath of laurel leaves. Beneath it, etched in bold, unmistakable brass lettering, were the words, Vanguard Holdings. My vision blurred. The polished hallway around me seemed to tilt. Suddenly, I wasn't 32 years old standing in a billionaire's mansion. I was 17 again, sitting on the faded carpet of my parents' living room, holding a stack of foreclosure notices. I could hear my father's broken voice on the phone, begging for a little more time. I could see the logo on the aggressive, predatory legal letters that had flooded our mailbox for months. Letters from Vanguard Holdings, the anonymous corporate monolith that had orchestrated a hostile takeover of my father's manufacturing supply company. They hadn't just bought the company. They had aggressively dismantled it, freezing assets, calling in loans early, forcing my parents into a corner with ruthless, predatory litigation. The stress had broken my father's heart, leading to the massive coronary that killed him behind the wheel of his car, taking my mother, who was sitting in the passenger seat, with him. For 15 years, I had hated a ghost. Vanguard Holdings was a shell company, a corporate ghost town designed to shield its owners from liability and consequence. I had spent years trying to find out who was behind the curtain, who had pushed the buttons that ruined my family, but the trail was buried under mountains of red tape and offshore accounts. And now, here it was, framed like a trophy on Richard Sterling's wall. My hands began to tremble. I pressed them flat against the cool silk of my trousers, forcing myself to take a slow, agonizing breath. Richard and Evelyn Sterling weren't just wealthy snobs. They were the monsters under my bed. They were the reason I had spent my 20s exhausted, terrified, and alone. They were the reason Lily had grown up without a mother or father. I stood in the shadows of the hallway for a long time. The protective instinct that had driven me my entire adult life shifted, darkening into something much colder, much more precise. When I finally walked back into the drawing room, Richard was pouring a glass of scotch. He smiled at me, a wolf dressed in cashmere. "Everything all right, Clara? You look a bit pale." "I'm perfectly fine, Richard," I sadly said. My voice was calm, terrifyingly steady. I looked at the man who had destroyed my family, and I smiled back. "I was just admiring your home. It's amazing what a person can build, isn't it? Given the right acquisitions." Richard chuckled, missing the danger in my eyes entirely. "Indeed, it takes ruthlessness, Clara. Something I'm sure a small business owner like yourself can only begin to understand." "You have no idea," I thought, accepting the glass he handed me. "But you will." The drive back to the city that night was agonizingly quiet. Lily, exhausted by the sheer emotional weight of the Sterling estate and the effort of being constantly scrutinized, had fallen asleep against the passenger window. The soft, rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound in the car, but inside my mind, a hurricane was raging. Vanguard Holdings. The name pulsed behind my eyes with every flash of passing streetlights. For 15 years, I had built my life around a void left by a nameless, faceless corporate entity. Now, that entity had a name, a face, and a tailored bespoke suit. Richard Sterling was the architect of my parents' ruin. And now, my innocent, beautiful sister was preparing to bind her life, her name, and her future to his family. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel. The instinct to wake Lily up right then, to tell her everything, to turn the car around and scream the truth into the manicured silence of the Sterling estate was almost overwhelming. But I am a woman who has survived by playing the long game. Panic is a luxury for the protected. Strategy is the weapon of the self-made. If I told Lily the truth now, without proof, without a plan, it would only break her heart and force Julian to choose between the woman he loved and the parents he had known all his life. I needed more than righteous anger. I needed armor. 3 weeks later, that armor was tested. The invitation had come from Evelyn, a summons, really, disguised as a celebratory luncheon at the Sterling Enterprises corporate headquarters in Manhattan. Lily had been thrilled, assuming it was a peace offering. I knew better. Predators do not offer peace. They offer terms of surrender. The conference room on the 50th floor was a masterclass in intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked the sprawling concrete grid of the city, placing us literally and metaphorically above the rest of the world. Evelyn sat at the head of a massive mahogany table, sipping sparkling water with a twist of lemon, while Richard stood by the window, casting a long, imposing shadow. Julian was conspicuously absent, purportedly held up in a board meeting that Richard had conveniently scheduled at the exact same hour. "Lily, my dear," Evelyn began, her voice dripping with maternal warmth that didn't reach her calculating eyes. "Richard and I have been thinking a great deal about your future. Julian is our only son, and his happiness is paramount. We want to ensure that your transition into the Sterling family is as seamless and joyful as possible." Lily beamed, her hands clasped in her lap. "Thank you, Evelyn. That means so much to me." "To that end," Richard said, turning from the window and stepping toward the table, "we have arranged a few wedding gifts, early gifts to set your mind at ease." He slid a glossy, leather-bound portfolio across the polished wood. Lily opened it tentatively. Inside were architectural renderings of a stunning, light-filled art gallery in Chelsea, along with a deed of ownership bearing her name. Below it lay a certificate for a multi-million-dollar trust fund, established entirely for her personal use. Lily gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears immediately sprang to her eyes. I don't know what to say. This is too much. A gallery? For me?" "You are an artist," Evelyn said smoothly, smiling at Lily's overwhelming gratitude. "We want you to have the freedom to curate, to create, without the vulgar burden of worrying about rent or commercial viability. The trust will ensure you are comfortable, independently, forever." It was a beautiful, breathtaking illusion. A velvet-lined trap. I sat completely still, my eyes locked on the second, much thicker document that Richard had just placed on the table next to the portfolio. It was bound in heavy legal cardstock. "And this?" I asked, my voice flat, cutting through the emotional atmosphere of the room. Richard smiled, though his jaw remained rigid. "Standard family procedure, Clara. A prenuptial agreement. When you are dealing with a legacy the size of Sterling Enterprises, the lawyers insist on certain formalities. It's a mere technicality. It simply protects the generational wealth Julian is set to inherit, while guaranteeing Lily's trust and gallery remain entirely hers in the unlikely event of an annulment." Lily, blinded by the overwhelming generosity of the gallery, reached for the pen resting beside the document. "Of course," she said softly. "I don't care about Julian's money. I'm marrying him because I love him. I'll sign it right now." "No," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a sharp, commanding edge that brought the room to a dead halt. Lily froze, the pen hovering inches from the signature line. She looked at me, confused. Evelyn's smile thinned into a razor-sharp line. "Is there a problem, Clara? Surely a financial advisor such as yourself understands the necessity of asset protection." "I understand it perfectly, Evelyn," I replied, standing up and reaching across the table to pull the heavy document away from my sister. I tucked it under my arm. "Which is exactly why Lily won't be signing anything until my own legal counsel has had the opportunity to review it. Standard family procedure, as you said." Richard's eyes darkened, the facade of the benevolent patriarch slipping just enough to reveal the cold tactician beneath. "There is no need to complicate matters, Clara. The document is straightforward." "If it's straightforward, then my lawyer will have it back to you by tomorrow," I said politely, offering a smile that was entirely devoid of submission. I looked down at my sister. "Come on, Lily. Let's let Richard and Evelyn get back to their busy day." Lily, sensing the sudden, suffocating tension in the room, nodded and stood up. We walked to the elevator in silence. I could feel Richard's gaze burning into my back the entire way down the hall. That afternoon, I bypassed my own office and drove straight to the dusty, wood-paneled chambers of Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur was a 60-year-old contract lawyer who had helped me navigate the labyrinth of permits and leases when I first started my consulting firm. He was a man of fierce integrity, possessing a brilliant legal mind hidden behind wire-rimmed glasses and a penchant for cheap drip coffee. I dropped the 100-page document onto his cluttered desk. "Tell me where the poison is, Arthur." For 3 hours, the only sounds in the office were the ticking of a grandfather clock and the rustle of heavy paper as Arthur read through the labyrinthine clauses, his highlighter marking seemingly innocuous paragraphs. I paced the floor, my stomach tied in agonizing knots. Finally, Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked older, tired. "They are very good, Clara," he said softly. "The lawyers who drafted this are apex predators. The poison isn't in the obvious places." I stopped pacing, gripping the back of a guest chair. "Explain it to me." Arthur flipped to a page near the back, buried deep within the appendices regarding marital property definitions. "The trust fund and the gallery they are offering Lily, they are genuine, but they are bait. They've included a cross-collateralization clause regarding familial enterprise assets. They defined Lily's immediate familial assets to include your financial consulting firm." The air in the room grew suddenly thin. "My firm?" Arthur nodded grimly. "Because you are Lily's legal guardian and primary benefactor prior to the marriage, they have woven a legal fiction that treats your firm as a shared familial asset. The clause stipulates that in exchange for the gallery and the trust, the Sterling family gains a controlling, auditing interest in all shared familial ventures to ensure they align with the Sterling corporate portfolio standards." A cold, creeping horror washed over me. I sank into the chair. "They don't just want to protect Julian's money," Arthur continued, his voice heavy with disbelief. "They want your company, Clara. Your firm is highly profitable, completely clean, and possesses an impeccable reputation in the boutique financial sector. It's the perfect vehicle for a larger corporation to use for creative accounting without drawing federal scrutiny. If Lily signs this, the Sterlings have the legal right to absorb your business, audit your clients, and essentially push you out of the very company you spent 15 years building." It wasn't just about controlling Lily. It was about destroying me. Again, 15 years ago, Richard Sterling had wiped out my father's business. Now he was coming for mine, using my sister's love as the Trojan horse to breach my walls. It was a level of vindictive greed that defied comprehension. They knew I would never sell to them, so they were going to steal it through a marriage contract. "What happens if she doesn't sign it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then the Sterlings will likely refuse the marriage," Arthur said gently. "Or worse, they will make her life a living hell if she marries him anyway." I thanked Arthur, leaving his office and walking out into the chaotic, noisy streets of Manhattan. The city moved around me in a blur. I had spent my life protecting Lily from the harshness of the world, and now the very people she loved were preparing to serve her upon an altar of corporate greed. The rehearsal dinner, held 2 nights before the wedding, was a masterpiece of high society theater. The private dining room of a 5-star hotel was adorned with cascading white orchids and thousands of candles that cast a soft, forgiving glow over the elegantly dressed guests. Lily looked like a princess, laughing genuinely at something Julian whispered in her ear. They looked so young, so fiercely in love, entirely oblivious to the war being waged in the shadows around them. I wore a simple dark emerald gown, sipping a glass of champagne that tasted like ash in my mouth. I watched Richard and Evelyn holding court, accepting congratulations with practiced grace. Tonight was the night. The prenup was still unsigned, locked securely in my office safe. As the dinner wound down and guests began to mingle, I caught Richard's eye across the room. I gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the hallway. He excused himself from a conversation with a senator, his face impassive, and Evelyn quietly followed him. I led them into a small, private library adjacent to the dining hall. The room was soundproof, lined with decorative books and heavy velvet drapes. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut, the polite masks vanished. "I assume you have the signed document, Clara," Richard said, not bothering to offer a pleasantry. I set my evening bag down on a small side table. "I know about the cross-collateralization clause, Richard. I know you're trying to absorb my firm into Vanguard Holdings, or whatever shell company you're using this week to hide your acquisitions." Evelyn let out a soft, mocking sigh. "Oh, Clara, you're being hopelessly melodramatic. It's standard oversight to ensure Lily's family meets our corporate compliance." "Stop," I interrupted, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't insult my intelligence, Evelyn. I built my firm from nothing. I know every legal trick, every loophole, every parasitic maneuver in the book. You want my company because it's clean, and Sterling Enterprises hasn't been clean in a decade." Richard's eyes narrowed into dangerous, dark slits. The gentlemanly veneer completely evaporated, leaving behind the ruthless corporate raider who had destroyed my father. "You are overstepping, little girl." "I am protecting what is mine," I fired back, stepping closer to him, refusing to yield an inch of ground. "Lily will not sign that contract. You will remove the clause regarding my firm, or the wedding is off, and Julian will know exactly what kind of extortionists his parents really are." For a long moment, the room was terrifyingly silent. Then Richard did something that made my blood run cold. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a slim manila envelope. He tossed it onto the small table between us. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. "You think you are the only one who does their homework, Clara?" Richard asked, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. My heart hammered against my ribs as I picked up the envelope and opened the clasp. Inside was a stack of bank statements, wire transfer logs, and client portfolios bearing the letterhead of my consulting firm. But the numbers were wrong. There were massive, glaring discrepancies. Millions of dollars seemingly funneled into offshore accounts under my signature. "What is this?" I breathed, staring at the fabricated numbers. "These are forged." "They are incredibly convincing," Richard corrected smoothly, adjusting his cufflinks. "Convincing enough for a federal prosecutor. Our forensic accountants are the best in the world, Clara. We have created a perfect, flawless paper trail that shows you have been embezzling from your high-net-worth clients for the past 5 years." The room began to spin. "No one will believe this. My clients trust me. I have every receipt, every original document." "It won't matter," Evelyn interjected, her voice laced with venomous satisfaction. "The moment we hand this over to the SEC and the FBI, your firm's assets will be frozen. Your clients will flee in panic. The ensuing investigation will drag on for years, bankrupting you in legal fees. You will go to federal prison, Clara. You will lose your business, your reputation, and your freedom." I stared at the two of them. The true depth of their malevolence finally laid bare. They weren't just greedy, they were sociopathic. They would happily destroy an innocent woman's life just to secure a tactical advantage. "And Lily," Richard continued, taking a step closer, towering over me. "What happens to your precious sister when her guardian is a convicted felon? We will cancel the wedding, of course. Julian will be heartbroken, but he will understand. Lily will be left with nothing. No gallery, no trust. Just the shame of being the sister of a thief." He leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and raw cruelty. "You are going to ensure Lily signs that document tomorrow morning, Clara, and you are going to smile while she does it. Or I will bury you so deep, you will never see the sun again." I looked down at the forged documents in my trembling hands. I thought of the 15 years of grueling work. I thought of the late nights, the sacrifices, the sheer force of will it took to build my life. And then I thought of Lily, out there in the dining room, laughing, wearing her white dress, believing she was stepping into a fairy tale. I couldn't let them destroy her. I couldn't let her bear the punishment for a war she didn't even know we were fighting. The fight drained out of me, leaving behind a hollow, agonizing ache. I let my shoulders slump. I lowered my eyes, staring at the intricate pattern of the Persian rug beneath my feet. I let them see the defeat wash over my face. I let them believe they had broken me. "Okay," I whispered, my voice thick with unshed tears and forced submission. "Okay, she'll sign it." Evelyn smiled, a triumphant, predatory gleam in her eyes. "I knew you were a reasonable woman, Clara. Let's rejoin the party, shall we? It's a time for celebration." They turned and walked out of the library, leaving me alone in the silence. But as the door clicked shut, the tears in my eyes vanished. The trembling in my hands stopped. I looked up at the closed door, my jaw locking into place. They thought they had trapped me. They thought my love for my sister was a weakness they could exploit. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was just a businesswoman. They didn't realize I was a survivor who had already lost everything once. And I was going to burn their empire to the ground. The silence of my office at 2 a.m. was usually my sanctuary. For 15 years, the soft hum of the city below and the glow of my desk lamp had been my constant companions. This was where I had built my life, brick by agonizing brick. Now, it felt like a tomb. I sat in my leather chair, staring at the framed first dollar I had ever earned, hanging proudly on the wall opposite my desk. It was crisp, unremarkable to anyone else, but to me, it represented the exact moment I stopped being a terrified, orphaned teenager and became a provider. I had promised my parents' memory that Lily would never know the cold, hollow ache of poverty. I had kept that promise, and tomorrow I was going to lose it all to keep her safe. I pulled a sheet of heavy, cream-colored stationery from my drawer and picked up my fountain pen. My hand, which had remained entirely steady while facing down 2 billionaires, finally began to shake. "My dearest Lily," I wrote, the ink blurring as the first tear slipped down my cheek and splashed onto the paper. "By the time you read this, you will be a married woman. I want you to know that I am so incredibly proud of you. You are the best thing I have ever done. But I need you to be strong now. There is an investigation into my firm. A misunderstanding, I promise. But it will be loud, and it will be ugly. I cannot let it taint your new life. I am stepping away for a while. Trust Julian. Build your life, and never, ever let anyone make you feel like you do not belong." It was a lie, of course. The hardest, most agonizing lie I had ever told. I was going to let Richard Sterling's fabricated evidence destroy me. I would take the fall, endure the federal investigation, and likely go to prison. All so Lily could have her gallery, her trust, and her perfect, unblemished marriage. I folded the letter, sealing it in an envelope just as a soft, rhythmic tapping broke the heavy silence of the room. I froze. The tapping came again, sharper this time, against the frosted glass of my office door. I wiped my face quickly, smoothing my posture into the rigid professional stance I wore like armor, and walked over to unlock the door. When I pulled it open, the breath caught in my throat. Julian stood in the dimly lit hallway. He was still wearing the tailored tuxedo from the rehearsal dinner, but the bow tie was undone, hanging loosely around his neck. His face, usually so open and effortlessly bright, was pale and drawn tight with a mixture of shock, exhaustion, and profound grief. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world burn to ash. "Julian," I breathed, my hand gripping the doorknob. "What are you doing here? Where is Lily?" "She's asleep at the hotel with her bridesmaids," he said, his voice a hoarse, hollow rasp. He stepped past me into the office, his eyes scanning the room, landing briefly on the sealed envelope on my desk. "I didn't stay at the party after you left. I couldn't." I closed the door, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Julian, you shouldn't be here. If your parents—" "I heard," he interrupted, turning to face me. The raw anguish in his eyes made me stop dead in my tracks. "I saw the 3 of you slip into the library. My father has a specific look when he's about to close a hostile acquisition. I've seen it my whole life. I knew something was wrong. So I followed you. I stood on the other side of that velvet drape, and I listened." The room seemed to tilt. I reached for the edge of my desk to steady myself. "Julian, they forged federal documents, Clara," he whispered, running a trembling hand through his hair. "They threatened to send you to prison to force a signature on a prenuptial agreement. My own parents." He let out a choked, bitter laugh that held absolutely no humor. "I always knew they were cold. I knew they measured people by their net worth. But I thought there was a line. I thought they loved me enough not to destroy the family of the woman I love." "Julian, you have to pretend you don't know," I said urgently, stepping toward him. My protective instinct, usually reserved solely for Lily, flared fiercely for the young man standing in front of me. His heart was breaking, shattering against the realization of his parents' true nature. "If Richard knows you heard, he will cut you off completely. He will—" "Let him!" Julian snapped, the grief in his voice suddenly hardening into a razor-sharp fury. "Do you honestly think I care about the Sterling money now? Do you think I could ever look at Lily again, knowing my family bought her at the cost of your life?" He pointed at the letter on my desk. "You were going to do it, weren't you? You were going to let them ruin you just so Lily could have that stupid gallery." "I have to, Julian. You don't understand what they are capable of. They are Vanguard Holdings." Julian froze. The anger in his face morphed into utter bewilderment. "Vanguard? The shell company that—" He trailed off, the pieces clicking together in his mind. I had told him the story of our parents' bankruptcy months ago, though I had never known the name of the executioner until I saw the crest in his father's study. "Yes," I said quietly, the word tasting like bile. "They took everything from us 15 years ago. And now they are coming back for the rest. Julian sank into one of my guest chairs, burying his face in his hands. For a long minute, the only sound in the office was his ragged breathing. I didn't rush him. I knew what it felt like to have your foundation ripped out from under you. When he finally looked up, the boyish innocence was completely gone from his eyes. In its place was a cold, quiet resolve that looked terrifyingly like his father's, but driven by something entirely different. "My father is a meticulous man," Julian said, his voice dead flat. "He doesn't leave a paper trail for his illegal activities on the main Sterling Enterprise network. The SEC audits them too frequently." I frowned, confused by the sudden shift in logic. "Then where did he get the forged documents?" "He has a standalone server," Julian explained, sitting up straighter. "It's air-gapped, kept in a biometric safe hidden behind the Vanguard crest in his home study. He uses it for what he calls aggressive portfolio management. Off-the-books ledgers, blackmail material, shell company routing numbers." Julian stood up, buttoning his tuxedo jacket. "If the proof of your forged documents is anywhere, it's in that safe. And if I can get in, I can find exactly what else he's hiding." "Julian, no," I said, grabbing his arm. "It's suicide. If he catches you, he will destroy you too." Julian looked down at my hand, then met my eyes with a fierce, unbreakable loyalty. "Clara, you spent 15 years fighting in the dark to protect Lily. You are not fighting alone anymore. They are my parents, which means they are my responsibility. I am going to end this." The next 24 hours were a masterclass in psychological torture. It was the day before the wedding. While Lily was surrounded by florists, dress fitters, and laughing bridesmaids, blissfully unaware of the war raging beneath the surface of her fairy tale, Julian was walking back into the lion's den. We communicated only through brief, encrypted text messages. Julian returned to the Connecticut estate under the guise of needing a quiet place to write his wedding vows. The house was a chaotic swarm of event planners and caterers preparing for the massive reception, which played perfectly to his advantage. Richard and Evelyn were distracted, barking orders at the staff and fielding calls from international guests. At 3 p.m., my phone buzzed on my desk. In the study. "He's in the garden with the tent crew." My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I paced the length of my office, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. "Be careful." The code? Mom's birthday. Typical narcissist. He thinks no one else remembers it. 10 agonizing minutes passed. Then 20. I imagined 100 worst-case scenarios. Richard walking in, the safe triggering a silent alarm, Julian being cornered by his own father. Just as I was about to break protocol and call him, the phone chimed again. "Got it. You won't believe this. Meet me at Arthur's office in an hour." When I arrived at Arthur Penhaligon's law office, Julian was already there, sitting across from the weary lawyer. Placed in the center of Arthur's cluttered desk was a small silver flash drive. It looked entirely innocuous, yet it held the power to detonate a billionaire's empire. Arthur adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, plugging the drive into an encrypted standalone laptop he kept for highly sensitive reviews. "All right, Julian," Arthur grumbled, his eyes scanning the directories popping up on the screen. "Let's see what kind of dragons your father is hiding in his cave." For an hour, Arthur clicked through folders, his frown deepening with every passing minute. He opened spreadsheets, wire transfer logs, and confidential memorandums. The deeper he went, the paler he became. "Good Lord," Arthur whispered, taking off his glasses and rubbing his eyes. "Did you find the forged documents about my firm?" I asked, leaning over the desk. "I found them, Clara," Arthur said. "But they are the least of Richard Sterling's problems, and frankly they don't even make sense anymore in light of this." He turned the laptop screen toward us. It was a master ledger for Sterling Enterprises, completely different from the glowing financial reports published in the Wall Street Journal. The screen was a sea of red ink. "I don't understand," Julian said, squinting at the numbers. "Sterling Enterprises is worth billions." "Sterling Enterprises is a hollow shell," Arthur corrected, his voice grave. "Your father has been leveraging debt to pay off older debt for a decade. The real estate they supposedly own is leased. The liquid assets are tied up in margin calls. They are drowning in toxic debt, Julian. If the market shifts even a fraction of a percent, the entire Sterling empire will default. They are practically bankrupt." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. "That's impossible. If they are broke, Why on earth would they offer Lily a multi-million-dollar gallery and a trust fund? Where is that money coming from? Arthur clicked to a different folder, opening a scanned legal document that bore the seal of a deceased state judge. It's not coming from Richard. It's coming from your grandfather, Julian. This is his original, unredacted will and the stipulations of the generational trust. Julian leaned closer. My grandfather died when I was 10. My father told me the estate was absorbed into the main company. He lied, Arthur said flatly. Your grandfather despised your father's business practices. He saw the greed. He knew Richard would eventually gamble the family fortune away. So, he locked the core of the sterling wealth, nearly $800 million in untouchable diversified assets, into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. Who is the beneficiary? I asked, though I could already feel the heavy, sickening truth settling into my bones. Julian, Arthur said. But your grandfather was a cunning man. He placed a poison pill in the trust to ensure Richard could never touch it. Julian only inherits the money upon his 26th birthday or upon his marriage, whichever comes first. Julian blinked. I get married tomorrow. Exactly, Arthur said, tapping a specific paragraph on the screen. But here is the catch. The grandfather stipulated that the spouse must be an outsider, someone entirely unaffiliated with the sterling corporate umbrella, someone not entrenched in their high society rot. Furthermore, the trust dictates that the funds must be managed by an independent financial entity, chosen by the spouse, to ensure Richard cannot legally absorb the money into his failing company. The room went dead silent. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with a violent, breathtaking clarity. Richard didn't hate Lily. He desperately, frantically needed her. Lily was the key to unlocking the $800 million. But because of the grandfather's strict rules, Richard couldn't just take the money once Julian got married. He needed to control the independent financial entity that would manage it. He wanted my firm, I whispered, the sheer sociopathic brilliance of the plan washing over me. He wanted Lily to sign that prenup so that my clean, independent consulting firm would be legally cross-collateralized with the Sterling family. Once the trust dispersed the money to Julian and Lily, they would use my firm as a backdoor to launder the $800 million back into Sterling Enterprises to pay off Richard's toxic debt. And if you refused? Arthur asked quietly. If I refused, he threatened to frame me for embezzlement and send me to federal prison, I replied, the anger rising in my chest, no longer a simmer, but a roaring white-hot fire. Because if I am a convicted felon, Lily becomes legally vulnerable. Richard would easily petition a judge to have himself appointed as the conservator of Lily's finances, giving him direct control over the trust anyway. Julian sat back in his chair, staring blankly at the wall. The family he had loved, the father he had respected, had reduced him to nothing more than a pawn on a financial chessboard. They were going to use his marriage, destroy his sister-in-law, and steal his inheritance just to maintain their gilded illusion of power. They aren't billionaires, I said, my voice eerily calm as I looked at the man who would be my brother-in-law tomorrow. They are desperately broke, cornered animals. We aren't the charity cases, Julian. They are. Julian slowly turned his head to look at me. The grief was gone. The boy was gone. The man sitting across from me possessed a cold, terrifying clarity. Arthur, Julian said, his voice steady and precise, can you verify this data? Can you package it into a legally actionable dossier by tomorrow morning? Arthur nodded slowly, a predatory gleam appearing behind his spectacles. I can have it ready for the FBI and the SEC before the ink dries on your marriage certificate. Julian stood up, reaching out to shake Arthur's hand. Then he turned to me. Tomorrow, Julian said, my father is going to stand up in front of 400 of the wealthiest people in the country. He is going to try to humiliate you. He is going to try to force Lily's hand. And he is going to expect us to bow. I met his gaze, the pact between us sealed in the quiet shadows of the law office. Let him try, I said softly. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a masterclass in opulent intimidation. 10,000 white roses tumbled from crystal vases, their sweet, heavy scent masking the absolute rot at the core of the evening. 400 of the nation's wealthiest and most influential people sat at tables draped in silver silk, their diamonds catching the light of chandeliers that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Lily looked like an angel, She sat beside Julian at the head table, her face glowing with a pure, unadulterated joy that made my chest ache. She had no idea that the dress she wore, the flowers surrounding her, and the very food on her plate were paid for by a desperate mirage. She didn't know that the man sitting 2 seats away from her had spent the morning finalizing a plan to destroy her sister and steal her husband's future. I sat to Lily's right, my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded quietly in my lap. I wore a deep sapphire gown, simple and unadorned. Across the table, Richard and Evelyn Sterling held court. They were in their element, exchanging air kisses and polite laughter with senators and CEOs. Every time Richard's eyes met mine, a smug, cold certainty flickered in his gaze. He believed he had won. He believed the unsigned prenuptial agreement sitting in my purse was just a formality I would surrender the moment the cake was cut. As the final course was cleared, the soft string quartet faded into silence. Richard stood, smoothing the lapels of his bespoke tuxedo, and picked up a silver spoon. He tapped it against his crystal champagne flute. The delicate clink, clink, clink echoed through the massive room, bringing 400 hushed voices to a complete standstill. "Family," Richard began, his voice booming effortlessly across the ballroom, rich and commanding. "Friends, esteemed guests, tonight, we celebrate the expansion of the Sterling legacy." A polite ripple of applause washed over the room. Julian stared down at the table, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. "When Julian first brought Lily to us, we were, of course, protective," Richard continued, his eyes scanning the crowd, playing the role of the benevolent patriarch to perfection. "The Sterling name is not merely a title, it is an institution. We require excellence. We require grace." He paused, letting the silence stretch, and then he turned his gaze directly onto me. "Lily is a lovely girl," Richard said, his tone softening into something that sounded like pity to the untrained ear, but was laced with absolute venom to mine. But we must also acknowledge the unique circumstances of her upbringing. She was raised by her older sister, Clara, a woman who had to claw her way up from nothing, a woman who learned to survive, even if she couldn't quite learn how to belong. The ballroom grew uncomfortably still. A few guests shifted in their seats, exchanging sideways glances. Evelyn smiled serenely, sipping her champagne. "So," Richard raised his glass high, his voice echoing with mocking triumph. "Let us all raise a glass. To the woman who raised a child alone, but who must now step aside and let the adults handle the future. To Clara." 400 glasses raised in the air. 400 pairs of eyes turned to me, waiting for me to bow my head, to accept the humiliation, to drink the bitter wine of my own defeat. I did not reach for my glass. I stood up. The scrape of my chair against the marble floor was deafening in the quiet room. I didn't rush. I didn't show a singular ounce of fear or anger. I stood to my full height, looking directly into the eyes of the man who had destroyed my parents, and I let the absolute weight of 15 years of silent endurance fill the space between us. "I will not drink to a lie, Richard," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried a crystalline, terrifying clarity that cut through the ballroom like a scythe. A collective gasp rippled through the front tables. Lily's eyes widened in shock. "Clara?" she whispered. Richard's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes flashing with a violent warning. "Clara," he warned, his voice dropping an octave, meant only for me. "Sit down. Now is not the time for your emotional theatrics. You know what is at stake." "I know exactly what is at stake," I replied, stepping away from my chair, my voice ringing out for the entire room to hear. "I know that 15 years ago, a shadow corporation called Vanguard Holdings aggressively, illegally dismantled my father's business, driving him to an early grave. I know that for 15 years I worked day and night to protect my sister from the cruelty of men who hide behind offshore accounts and bespoke suits." The whispers began, a low, urgent buzzing that spread like wildfire to the back of the room. Evelyn's face went chalk white. She reached out, gripping Richard's arm. "Security," Richard barked, abandoning the microphone, his facade cracking completely. "Escort this woman out. She is unstable. And call the police. I have evidence in my study that she has been embezzling from her own clients. She's a fraud." 2 broad-shouldered security guards started moving swiftly toward the head table. Lily jumped up, her hands trembling, looking frantically between me and Richard. "What is going on? Embezzling? Clara, what is he talking about?" "He's talking about forged documents, Lily," a new voice rang out. The security guards stopped dead in their tracks. The entire ballroom turned. Julian had stood up. He wasn't looking at the crowd, and he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his father with a level of disgust so profound it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. "Julian," Richard snapped, his face flushing dark red. "Sit down. Your sister-in-law is a criminal attempting to extort this family." "No, Dad," Julian said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a small printed manifesto, Arthur Penhaligon's summary of the flash drive. He dropped it onto the white silk tablecloth. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "She's the only honest person at this table." Julian turned to the crowd of billionaires, politicians, and socialites. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth has its own volume. "My father is not a billionaire," Julian announced into the dead silent room. "Sterling Enterprises is drowning in billions of dollars of toxic leveraged debt. They are bankrupt in every way a family can be." Evelyn let out a sharp, horrified cry, covering her mouth. The guests began to murmur loudly now, the word bankrupt sending a shockwave through the elite crowd. People began reaching for their phones. "Julian, you have lost your mind," Richard hissed, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the table. "You know nothing about the corporate structures." "I know about grandfather's trust," Julian interrupted, the final nail in the coffin. "I know about the $800 million that he locked away from you because he knew you were a parasite. I know that you needed me to marry Lily today just so you could trigger the payout. And I know you tried to blackmail Clara with forged federal documents so you could force her to hand over her firm, giving you a legal backdoor to launder my inheritance to save your failing empire." Lily gasped, the horrifying reality crashing down on her. She stumbled back, away from Richard and Evelyn, her hands covering her face. Julian immediately stepped to her side, wrapping his arms around her, shielding her. Richard's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged across the table toward Julian, knocking over crystal glasses, sending champagne spilling across the white silk like a stain. "You ungrateful little bastard! I built this life for you. I will destroy you. I will have you both ruined." "You can't ruin anyone anymore, Richard," I said quietly. I looked toward the massive oak doors at the back of the ballroom. They swung open, not with dramatic flair, but with the heavy, inevitable weight of the law. A dozen men and women in dark windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the SEC walked into the room. The music had stopped. The whispers had stopped. The only sound was the clicking of the agents' shoes on the marble floor as they walked directly down the center aisle, parting the sea of high society guests. "Richard Sterling," the lead agent said, holding up a federal warrant. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, corporate espionage, extortion, and the forgery of federal documents. Evelyn Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy and accessory to financial fraud." Richard froze. The fight completely drained out of him, leaving behind nothing but an old, tired man whose house of cards had finally collapsed. He didn't scream. He didn't fight. When they placed the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists, the metal clicking shut sounded incredibly small in the vast, opulent room. Evelyn wept quietly, hiding her face from the flashes of cell phone cameras as the guests, people they had spent their entire lives trying to impress, documented their humiliating downfall. As they were led away, the ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of panic and gossip, but at the head table, there was only a profound, exhausted peace. I walked around the table to where Lily stood trembling in Julian's arms. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, her perfect makeup ruined. "Clara," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know. I would have never—" "Shh," I whispered, pulling her into my arms, holding her just as tightly as I had when she was 7 years old, and crying for our mother. "I know, sweetie, I know. You are safe. That's all that matters. You are safe." Julian looked at me over Lily's shoulder. He was stripped of his family, his legacy, and the only life he had ever known. But as he held his wife, his eyes were clear, bright, and entirely free. The wedding didn't end with a grand dance or a towering cake. It ended with the truth. And sometimes the truth is the most beautiful celebration of all. 1 year later, the bell above the door chimed, a cheerful, bright sound that cut through the crisp autumn air. I wiped my hands on a paper towel and stepped out from the small back office. The space was filled with the smell of fresh oil paint, turpentine, and roasting coffee. Sunlight streamed through the large floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dozens of vibrant, breathtaking canvases. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar gallery in Chelsea. It was a modest, beautiful brick studio in Brooklyn, and it was entirely ours. Lily was standing on a stepladder, laughing as she tried to hang a new landscape painting, while Julian, covered in a light dusting of drywall powder, tried to guide her from below. "A little to the left, Mrs. Sterling," Julian teased, grinning up at her. "It is perfectly centered, Mr. Sterling. Your eyes are just crooked," Lily shot back, though she adjusted the frame anyway. I leaned against the door frame, a warm cup of coffee in my hands, watching them. The fallout from the Plaza Hotel had been absolute. Sterling Enterprises had collapsed within weeks, the SEC freezing every asset and liquidating the rest to pay off the mountains of toxic debt. Richard and Evelyn were currently awaiting sentencing in federal court, their high society friends having abandoned them the moment the indictments were unsealed. Julian had walked away from the wreckage without a backward glance. When he turned 26, the grandfather's trust had finally dispersed. He hadn't bought a mansion or a yacht. He had bought this small building in Brooklyn. He opened the gallery for Lily on the ground floor, and above it, a bright, spacious apartment for them to live in. He had taken a job teaching economics at a local university, finding more joy in a classroom than he ever had in a corporate boardroom. And me? My firm had survived the scrutiny flawlessly. When the FBI audited my books, they found exactly what I had always promised my clients: absolute integrity. Business had actually doubled in the last year, fueled by quiet recommendations from people who respected a woman who refused to be bullied. Lily stepped down from the ladder and walked over to me, wrapping her arms around my waist and resting her head on my shoulder. "It's perfect, Clara," she murmured, looking out at the gallery. "It's small, but it's real." "It's the most beautiful gallery in the world," I agreed, kissing the top of her head. Julian walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans. He looked at me, a quiet, profound gratitude in his eyes. He didn't need to say thank you. We had forged a bond in the fire of his family's destruction that words could never adequately capture. As I stood there with my sister and the man who had proven himself worthy of her, I realized something important. For 15 years, I had thought that survival was just about holding on. I thought it was about building walls high enough so that the monsters couldn't get in. But I was wrong. True wealth isn't found in a trust fund, and power isn't found in the ability to intimidate others. True power is the quiet dignity of knowing exactly who you are, what you are worth, and refusing to let anyone, no matter how rich or ruthless, tell you otherwise. The Sterling family had tried to bury us. They didn't realize we were seeds. And in the warm sunlight of our hard-won freedom, we had finally bloomed.